Hello everyone. Welcome to another installment of All Things Microsoft Dynamics GP. Today we're going to talk about fixed assets and really the 101. We're going to talk about the setup, talk about setting up assets, retirements, depreciation, transactions, reports, smart view, SmartList, the whole 9 yards. So I'm excited, stay tuned, and we're going to cover a lot in a very short period of time. So let's dive right in. So here we are in Dynamics GP 2018, and right off the bat, just to clear the table, fixed assets is not my favorite module. It does what it's needed to do. If you are creative, if you have a little bit of extra time on your hand, if you want to list in services of, I don't know, a la carte GP, it can be a great solution. But out of the box, it's a little dry. And then you might notice as we go through it, some of the features that you might take for granted in other modules, you'll see it gets a little wishy-washy as we're going through some of the fixed asset transaction windows and really just navigating the system as a whole. So we'll kind of touch on those as we go through here, but that's just my 2 cents on fixed assets before we dive in. But you're not here to listen to my opinions, so let's go ahead, let's take a look. So I'm going to start right in the setup. In fixed assets, if you do not already have it installed, you can install it through your GP Media installation file. And then I believe you also have to get it registered. Once it's installed, once it's registered, it'll be all within the financial module of Dynamics. So you'll see I'm in the setup. As you would imagine, there is all the fixed asset setup window. You'll notice I dropped down the typical financial stuff here. So again, it's just a separate section within the financial module. And you'll notice that kind of same story holds true through all of these. I got my financial, which is my typical journal entries, all my GL information, but we're not looking at that today. And then here's my fixed assets. All right, so back to the setup. First thing we want to take a look at here is the company setup. So with the company setup, anytime you set up a new module, I always recommend hitting F1 on your keyboard, and you will see it brings open the Microsoft Dynamics GP help window. So we're going to cover a lot of the obvious things today, but some of the things that might require a little more reading or a little more understanding, you can always ask us questions, but again, you can always hit F1 on your keyboard and open up the help window. So if I'm in the help window here, it's the company setup window is a window that I hadn't selected, and I can actually select the fields listing, and you'll see that it is a listing of all the fields in this window, and it gives me a little bit of information on each one of them. So I'm going to get out of here. Let's talk about the important things though. The book, the corporate book, that is the book that is actually going to hit your general ledger. With fixed assets, you might have multiple books in the system. One of them might hit your general ledger, and then you might have parallel books for tax purposes, say property tax or ACE, AMT, federal, state. Those are all different types of books that you can have set up in the system. And you'll see as we set up assets in the system that I will set it up for the internal stuff, but then the rest of the books will automatically get added in the system. And that'll make more sense as we get into this a little bit deeper. Other things to note here, a very nice feature of fixed assets is it lets you go ahead and auto-generate the next asset ID. So you'll notice if you're familiar with the customers or vendors, there's not really something like that. You can't auto-generate the next customer or vendor without a little bit of trickery there. So that is a nice feature here. So I would highly recommend always selecting that. So, and you'll see my asset ID format is just going to be A with some digits behind it. All right, going through some of the options here. Some of the ones that stand out and are something you want to consider here is auto add book information. So that is, as I mentioned, you can have multiple books in the system. If you want to just set up an asset and then have all the book information automatically add, so say the maker's format automatically adds for federal. If we want an asset to always fully depreciate for a certain book, we can set that up to automatically happen in the system. So auto add book info, that's important. Validate custodian. When I'm setting up assets, I can actually tag a custodian to that asset. The custodian, so if I'm setting up a computer, I can actually say the custodian is going to be Joe Schmo. So if I have validate custodian here, that makes me pick from a list of employees. If I do not have it selected, I can just basically free text in Joe Schmo. So keep that in mind. Post in detail versus post in summary. When you're going through the fixed assets module, you might run depreciation and it might depreciate 50 different assets for the month. Well, if you only want to see one distribution to your depreciation expense and then 1 credit to your accumulated depreciation, you might not post in detail. So I'm going to leave it disabled because I just want to see it collapse when it hits my general ledger. Some other options here, purchasing options. If you plan to pay invoices in the system and have those flow through to the fixed asset module, you will want to have these options selected. Delete purchasing transactions immediately. I would recommend keeping that enabled because there's a process to go in here and delete purchasing transactions after the fact, but if we've already gone through the process to set up a purchase into an asset, let's go ahead and have it automatically delete from the system. All right, moving on here, the account section here, this is just going to be your default debits and credits for basically every asset that occurs in the system. You'll be able to change these with each asset that you set up, but here are your system defaults. User defined here, what's nice about fixed assets is you do have quite a few different fields here. This is without getting something like extender put into the system, which gives you additional fields. So just the user defined fields, you'll see that I put in a division and I also put in a project number. And with my project number, I made it available so that I could pick it from a list. So I can actually have a list of projects in the system, and as I set up an asset, I can kind of tag my assets to a certain project. So just a couple examples of what you can use your user defined field. Okay, moving on from there, let's go back and let's take a look at our books. So you'll see I have a couple of different books out here in the system. I have my AMT, my federal, and my internal. As we saw before in the company setup window, my internal was my corporate book. So this is the book that is going to actually hit the general ledger. And I have it set so that when I create a new asset with all my options enabled, that asset will automatically add the internal book information. So next thing to take a look at here is the book class. So as we're setting up assets in the system, the most important thing to have set up is the class. So when I set up a automobile, this automobile says with the internal book, depreciated with straight line, make the averaging convention full period. If we click through here, we have quite a few different options. I'm actually going to change it to none for the time being, and we'll kind of talk about that as we get into actually adding some assets. So for my internal book, I'm going to set it to none. Switch over, leaving that as is. My default depreciable life for automobiles is 5 years. And then a couple different options here that won't really apply to my internal book information. When we start setting up some of the tax books, you'll see that you have a special depreciation allowance. You know, with the latest tax laws, I believe you can depreciate an automobile 100% in the year that it's placed in service. So this is actually where when I set up my tax books, I would have it set up to yes and depreciating at 100%. But again, I'm still focused on my internal book. And another note here is for this class, for this book, go ahead and auto add that book info. So that's the third time we've seen it. And if not all 3 of those options are selected, it's not going to add the book information automatically. So just something to keep in mind. So let's take a look at the same class with a different book, the federal. So this would be a pretty good example. I want to go ahead and I want this asset to fully depreciate in the year that it's placed in service. And then with the rules of makers, which I won't dive too deep into now, just notice here that there is no makers option, but how makers is calculated can be set up using a couple of these different fields here. So I believe it's 200% double declining balance, half year depreciation method, a straight line cutover, and with a combination of those fields, that gives you your makers calculations. So very important, GP, yes, can handle makers. And again here, you see that for federal tax purposes, this asset, automobile, would depreciate over 5 years as well. And you'll see I have a couple different types of classes in here. I have buildings set up, I have computers set up in the system, equipment, and furniture and fixtures. So the first thing I'm going to do when I'm setting up an asset is I'm going to be picking one of these classes, and that's going to do all of this book information for me because I had the auto add book information selected. All right. So next thing that's important, the account group, we kind of talked about that earlier. There are defaults. You can define defaults in the system. So when I have a computer, if I want my computer to depreciate to a different set of accounts than say a building, this is where I would set that information up. And one thing to note here is my clearing account. When I actually set up my asset, it's going to debit fixed assets and it's going to credit this clearing account. So that is important. And other setup items quickly. We do have the ability to set up insurance information. The location. This is going to be the actual city, state, county that you are tagging to each individual asset. Keep that in mind. Location is city, state, county. Physical location. Physical location is another level of locational tracking for an asset. So you'll notice that when I set up a physical location, I can actually tag my location. So if I'm using that Atlanta example that I just showed, you'll see this is actually saying this is building 1, room 100 for my location that's in Atlanta. My location that's in Atlanta. So again, it's just an additional level of locational tracking for each asset. So I'll save that. The purchasing posting accounts, this is important. So when I am processing payables transactions, I'm not going to hit my fixed assets account directly. No, I'm going to debit this clearing account. So that way I'll debit the clearing account, I post the invoice, and then when I later go and I set up the asset, it's going to debit the fixed asset account and credit the clearing account, netting it out. So this clearing account should never really have a balance. Definitely not at month end. You might carry it a couple days during the month, but the whole point is that it is a clearing account. Clears out during the process of setting up a new asset. So my clearing account here is 1590, and we will take a look at that later as well. All right, so quarters. So even if you do not think you will use quarters for any of your calculations, I would highly recommend setting them up. There's no harm in setting them up, and I've actually run into issues with the fixed asset system by not having the quarters set up. So recommendation there is set up your quarters regardless. My calendar follows my fiscal calendar follows a yearly calendar, so my quarters are January to March and so forth. So I would set up my initial quarters here, beginning, end date, middle date, and then once I have my first window set up here, I just select build quarters, and then I'll get this option. Do you want to build the quarters for all the years in your calendar? You select yes, or build. And there we are, we have our quarters built. I will backtrack a little bit here, hopefully not a big surprise, but the calendar setup, this is kind of what that looks like as well. And once you have set up 1 year in your calendar, you can actually go over here, select this build calendar, and build out as many calendar years as you like. I would recommend, again, building out tons and tons of calendar years at once. They're in there, you don't have to worry about it, they're not hurt anything, they won't break anything in the future. Last couple things here, retirement codes. You'll see as we get into the retirement process, you can tag an additional bit of information, being this retirement code, so you can use it for reporting later. And structure. So we talked about a couple different locations so far, the location ID, the physical location. Well, you also have the structure. So if I want to tag a asset at a particular building at a location, I can do that with the structure. So that covers the setup. So now let's move into the cards. So just like purchasing module, sales module, financial module, the rest of the financial module here, the cards, that's where you're setting up your master records. Cards, that's where you're going to set up your fixed asset. So let's go to the process of setting up an asset. So I'm going to go to the fixed assets, general, under cards. And you'll see here, the first thing that I'm prompted with, I mentioned it earlier, is the most important thing, it is that class ID. So of course I'm going to start with my class ID. I'm going to hit the select on the class ID lookup, and I'm going to set up an automobile. You'll see there from our company setup earlier, my asset ID is defaulting in there with A001. The next asset that I set up will automatically go to 002. Nice little feature. The suffix. So the suffix is one of a few different ways that you can tie assets together. I will kind of leave it at that. Behind the scenes, there's an asset index that distinctly identifies each asset, but when you're looking in the system, the identifier would be the asset ID and the suffix. So the asset ID and the suffix represent that single asset. An example might be if I'm componentizing, say, a piece of machinery, I might have one asset ID in the system, and that might represent a belt. That will be my suffix 1. Then my next asset ID will still be the same asset ID, and then I'll have suffix 2, and that will represent a motor, something of that sort. So that's kind of the suffix terminology there. All right, the description, we'll go with 2018 Toyota pickup. Extended description, I'll leave it blank for now. Short name, you can leave it blank. All right, so the master asset ID, that's just another way, again, to tie together asset components. So if, say, I was setting up not a Toyota pickup, but say I was setting up a Toyota bed, truck bed, my master asset ID might actually be the pickup truck, and that's how I would tie the two together. So for now, I'm going to leave it blank. The type field, property type, these fields are really informational only. They're only used for reporting. They don't really drive anything in the system. So for now, I'm going to leave this at a new asset, and it is a personal item. All right, my account group ID, in the system I have it set for automobiles to depreciate to different accounts than buildings do. So I have a particular account group ID for my vehicles. My acquisition date, I'll put the date that I actually acquired the asset. The acquisition date will default the date that your asset becomes placed in service and begins depreciating. So keep that in mind. We'll see that here in a moment. My acquisition cost. Trucks are pretty expensive these days, so let's go with $50,000. Now, if this asset did not come from the purchasing module, I still have the ability to go in here and add a bunch of purchasing related information. So I could say invoice from Toyota, and I can actually select my vendor. So now, later in reporting, I can actually report on this information and say that, okay, this asset is in here for $50,000. Well, it's this invoice. Oops. It's this invoice from Ace Travel. The invoice number was actually ABC123. And again, I have the ability to capture that information even though it didn't necessarily come from the purchasing module. You'll see later when we actually bring an invoice from the purchasing module, it will default this information in here automatically. All right, so I'm going to select OK. Physical location ID, we mentioned earlier, our example was if there were a particular building or something, I could tag the physical location ID. For now, I'm going to leave it blank. The asset label, this is optional. If you actually are tagging your assets with, say, barcode, this would be a good place to put that barcode information. One thing to note with the asset label, the information that you put in there, it is distinct, meaning I cannot put in 123 on multiple assets. If I save this asset with asset label 123 and then I try to put asset label 123 on the next asset, it's going to bomb out and say it already exists. So my label, I don't have one for this truck, I'm going to leave it blank. Structure ID, again, just another way to tag informational, locational information. I'm going to leave it blank. Custodian, you'll recall earlier I was talking about the settings of validating custodian. So I have two options here. I left the option disabled. With me leaving the option disabled, I don't necessarily have to go in here and pick one of these employees that I've set up in the system. I can literally just type in Joe Schmo, and it doesn't validate the custodian, and therefore it's saved in there with Joe Schmo. If you want to go through the process of adding custodians to the system, adding employees to the system, you can certainly do that. You know, maybe if you already have payroll in GP, it makes sense to use a custodian. But for me, I don't want to have to manage my employees in a employee list in GP. So I'm just going to leave this field basically free text. Manufacturer name. good thing to use. Drill into the arrow, and then you have the ability to put in the serial number here. So of course I'm doing a truck, and then I could also put in the model number. Not the model number, but you get the point. Warranty date as well. Now none of this information does anything, but it is in the system for reporting purposes later. Location ID. Let's go ahead and do our lookup here. And I'm going to go ahead and say this is at Atlanta. So later when I'm doing my reporting for, say, property tax purposes, I can actually run a report that says this asset is at Atlanta, and Atlanta is this city, state, county. Quantity, I'm going to leave it at 1. Rest of this information, I'm going to leave it at 1. All right, so very important. Again, this is now the 4th time we've seen this option, but leave it enabled, because if I were to deselect this and then go up here and hit save, none of my books would get added. But I'm going to leave it selected. As soon as I hit save, I've now added it for 3 different books in the system. So I'm going to go up here, go to book, and then if I click through my books here, you'll notice that this delete option is enabled, meaning it is already saved with this book. So internal, it's defaulted from our book class setup, 5 years. If I wanted to change it to say 3 years, I could do that in here. If I were acquiring an asset and it already had year-to-date or life-to-date depreciation information, I could add that information now. If I knew that this asset had an estimated salvage value of, say, $10,000, I could put that in there as well. So we'll go with that example here. So I have an asset for $50,000 that has a $10,000 estimated salvage value in 3 years. That means that I'm going to depreciate $40,000 over 3 years, starting on 8/14/2018. So that's kind of how the system works. So your place in service date, obviously important. Your original life years is important, and your cost basis less your salvage value, also very important. Other things to note here, this information defaulted from our book class setup, but if for whatever reason I wanted this asset to depreciate differently, I could toggle the options here as well. All right, so I'm gonna hit save. This is worth noting. Anytime you make a change to a already saved asset in the system, so remember the auto add book information was selected, so the asset was already saved with the internal book. I made a change, and then I'm prompted to handle that change. It says I've changed the depreciation sensitive field. Do you want to continue? Yes. These options, very, very important. If I select life, for this asset, it wouldn't really make a difference because I'm just now putting it in service. But if I had an asset that was placed in service 20 years ago, and then I changed the depreciation method to half year, it's going to go back 20 years and basically recalculate each one of those periods over the 20 years to basically catch up your depreciation. If I select year, that's going to do the same thing, but it's only going to do it for this fiscal year. If I select recalculate, it's going to say, okay, take my new settings that I've just changed and recalculate my future depreciation based on the settings that I just applied. So recalculate is really take my changes and spread it over the remaining life of this asset. So that's what I'm going to go with today. Recalculate, and the changes I just made are now in here. All right, so I'm going to save in this window again, close out, and here's my asset back here. I'm going to close out. Oh, sorry. Before I close out, let's do the go to. Let's take a look at the accounts here. So there are the accounts from the account group ID that I stored. One thing to note, and I mentioned there's a couple of things that kind of drive me up a wall with the fixed asset system. The account group ID itself, which was vehicles, does not technically save with the asset. So it's not like an additional class field that you might see with the customer vendor. As soon as I hit save here, it's gone. So I'm not actually saving that account group ID to this asset. I'm saving the accounts that are associated with the account group ID. So just a small note. Last thing I wanted to look at here, if I go to the user data, I had set up a couple of user defined fields earlier. If this asset came from a project that I had in the works, I can use my lookup button here to select one of the existing projects. If it is a new project, let's go with project 999. I tab out. Do you want to add this value? Yes. Add this project? Yes. So now it's in there to be tagged for future projects. All right, save. So that's the process of setting up a new asset. So what can we do with the asset from this point? I'm going to go to routines, and I can do a couple different things here. I can run my depreciation, I can run my projection. Other notes with this is this is where I'm also going to do my year-end close, and I'll also go back and I'll circle back and do my GL posting here later. But I'm going to start with the depreciate option. So we placed that asset in service as of, I believe it was 8/1/2027. I have to double check that, but it was a little ways out. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to depreciate my internal book. So this is a preference thing. You don't necessarily have to depreciate all of your books if you don't want to. So if you only do tax reporting things with the fixed asset system once or twice a year, there's no real need to depreciate those books each month as you go. So say if you have that matters when you have a lot of assets in the system, you're just going to bog down the time it takes to run the depreciation process. So I'm just going to select internal for now. I'm going to depreciate all assets, and to be honest, I can't remember when this asset was actually placed in service, so I'm going to depreciate it out pretty far here. 2027. And I'm going to select depreciate. So as that process runs, you'll notice there's another option up here to reverse depreciation. So if I ever run the depreciation process and for whatever reason I depreciated out way too far and I need to back the system up, I could select reverse depreciation and I could set back what I want to depreciate it back to. So that back to date, that's the date that the system is going to reverse depreciation back to. So that means that anything past 08, 01, 2018, that depreciation expense is going to be removed from the system and essentially backed out. So just a note there. As I was talking, the blue bar did run across the bottom here. It is now gone. The depreciation button is now active again. I now know that the depreciation process is complete. So I close out. You'll notice that I haven't gotten any sort of report here yet. That's how the system works. I now have to go and run my reports after the fact. We'll take a look at that here in a moment. I did want to show the projection window quickly here. Similar window to the depreciation window. I can actually run a projection out as far as I want for as many books as I want. And after the projection process would run, I can then go and pull the report that I want to look at in the system. So I'm going to close there. And let's go take a look at a couple of reports here. So at this time, I should be able to report on my depreciation expense for the assets that are in the system. So if I go to reports, fixed assets, depreciation, I'm going to go ahead and just do the depreciation detail. Let's go with the sample report, include all assets. The current amounts is the depreciation run that I just ran. So that's the current depreciation amount in the system right now. Is what I just now ran it for. So that's what the default is set to here. If I want to go ahead and put the date that I know I just depreciated to, I did 08/31/2027. I can put that in there as well. The book, I want to report on my internal book. And let's go ahead and push this report to the screen. All right, so this is a report that I'm getting by default from the system, and you'll see that it's basically breaking down period by period what my depreciation expense was. And I believe if I scroll all the way to the bottom, I should see my latest asset, A001. And there it is. So period by period. Again, I depreciated a ton there. That's not typical, but that's why I see so much in here. If you do recall, I did set up that asset for $50,000, $10,000 salvage value, and I depreciated it out so far that the entire asset has depreciated $40 grand. That's all I get with that asset. So there's my depreciation report. And one other good area for depreciation reports and fixed asset reports in general, it's under Dynamics GP. Let's go to SmartList. fixed assets, and fixed assets books, and fixed assets. One thing to note is these reports are very dry. They're very generic. I think they're kind of lazy from Microsoft. You can do much more with the data in the fixed asset system than what Microsoft gives you here. So if you have any questions on what else you can do with SmartList, if you're a big SmartList, SmartView fan, and you want to do a lot more of your reporting in fixed assets in SmartList, it's all doable. I would recommend looking them up. Contact me, whatever you want to do, but you can get much better reporting out of here. By default, I got this fixed assets book report. So if I were to take this report, filter it on the internal book, and look at my current run depreciation amount, the total of this is my depreciation expense that I just booked in the system. And again, you can do much more with SmartList than what you have here, so just keep that in mind. So that's it for reporting there. One thing I haven't talked about yet is, what about the GL? Well, we've added an asset, we've run depreciation out a very long time. We technically haven't hit the GL yet. With the fixed asset system, all of your transactions build in basically a pending batch. You have to go and run the posting process to post that batch to the general ledger, and then you have to go and post it one more time. I'll show you what I mean. So under routines, fixed assets, GL posting, I would recommend that this process is run at least once a month, because you want to make sure you're actually hitting your GL before the end of the month, so that way you can reconcile. But if you need to see your depreciation expense, or you need to see your balance sheet more frequently than once a month, then I would go in here and run this process more than once a month. For the posting date here, I'm going to go ahead and do the end of 04/2027. I would say that this is all April 2027 activity. And I'm actually just going to grab everything in the system, but I could add filters here and say that, okay, only pull periods 1 through 4, since that's what I'm working with here. So 2027 001, sorry, 2027 001 through 2027 004. I could put that filter in there, so that way I don't pick up anything in the future, but for now, I'm going to go ahead and select it all. So select process, and we'll talk about this here for a moment. So you'll see here, I have my fixed asset add, my source document here. So 50,000, look familiar? That's the asset that I added earlier in the system. If I were to click on that line, click source document, I can drill back and get in a couple extra bits of additional information. Again, there was my Toyota pickup. I say that this is related to the cost of the asset. It's pulling the cost distribution from the system. And then as I scroll down here, you see I have a whole lot of depreciation lines. So since we had actually run a ton of depreciation at once and we're posting it all at once, you'll see that if I click a line here and click source document, this fixed asset period is from 2027 period 8. So I'm actually taking multiple periods of depreciation and I'm going to post them all on a single day. So that's useful. So if I'm working today and I add an asset that should have been placed in service, say 6 months ago, I can still add that in the system as of 6 months ago, and then I can run the posting process to take the last 6 months of catch-up activity and put them just on today. So keep that in mind. That is why I see 2027 period 8, even though I'm working in 04/30/2027. All right, so this is kind of my batch. If I wanted to, I could print my edit list here, but I'm good to go here. I'm going to go ahead and hit post. I'm not going to print my reports. You saw the line down here. The posting process, just like it did on the depreciation window, there's always going to be a status bar across the bottom. Once the status bar is complete, and once these options up here kind of re-enable themselves, so the process is re-enabled, I know the posting process is complete. So I'm going to close this window. Now, one of the other frustrating things with the fixed asset system is there is no post through. Frustrating. I always have to post to the general ledger, and then I have to go into the general ledger, select my FA TRX batch, and post it once more to finalize. Again, if I wanted to print my posting journal here, I could do that here as well. So I'm going to close out, posted, done, complete. All right, so let's go back and let's take a look more at the fixed assets here. So I've set up an asset, I've depreciated an asset, I posted to the general ledger. Well, what else can we do? Under transactions, that's where you can do things like retire, transfer. I can actually do a mass retirement, a mass transfer. I can do intercompany transfer. All that information, all those transactions are under transactions. So let's go ahead and take a look at retire. If I want to go ahead and select a existing asset in the system, the retirement date, the retirement code. This information, for the most part, is reporting information only. If you have questions on what each one of these do, I would be happy to go into more detail with you, but I would be talking on this video forever if I did it right now. So I'm just going to select other. Remember, I can always hit my F1 key, go to fields, and take a look at the information I can find from the system here. All right, the retirement code, this comes from our setup options. So we set up a couple different things in the system. Again, all used for reporting purposes. So this asset, I could say it was a lost asset. So at the end of the year, I could say, okay, show me all my retirements that we just flat out lost. Not a good thing, but we can do that with our fixed asset system here. So the cost of the retirement here, I could put that information in here. So if it were a sale, that's where it would make sense. Cash proceeds, similar thing. One thing to note, cash proceeds does not tie to a checkbook. It'll just go to the cash proceeds account that's attached to this asset. Non-cash proceeds, and kind of like the cost, you also have another field for expenses of the retirement here. So I can retire that asset, but I will leave it alone. Let's take a look at transfer. So when do you book a transfer? If I am taking an asset from one set of GL accounts to another, it is a good idea to book a transfer, because when I do that, it's going to actually debit and credit the new accounts that are associated there. If I just open up an asset and then I change the GL accounts, it's not going to do any sort of journal entry for me. So again, if I want to take an asset from one set of GL accounts to another, do not just open up the asset and change the GL accounts, because it won't do anything. You actually want to go in here, select your asset, and select your new GL accounts, so that when I hit transfer, it's actually going to take it out of the old account, put it into the new. Other reasons you might do a transfer is if I am getting close to maybe the end of the fiscal year, the end of your calendar year, needed to do property tax reporting. Kind of the similar concept with the transfer. If I open up an asset and I take it from location A and I move it to location B, I have no audit trail in the system. Nothing really happens. I'm just changing a field. If I go in here and I book a transfer from Alpharetta and I would change it to Atlanta, I can now build my reports to say, show me all of my assets as of the end of this calendar year, but take into account the assets that I've transferred since then. So that's another reason why you might book a transfer, and I guess that's really it here. Intercompany transfer, I don't think any surprises there. If you have multiple companies in your environment and you do not have MEM, which I would highly recommend, you can do a cross-company asset transfer. Mass changes and mass retires. We'll take a quick look here. So this window is a little funky. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but in a sense, you can build a single use group in the system. Why I'm emphasizing single use here is it is just that. I cannot build a group and just say automobiles and then expect that group to always be updated in the future. That's not how it works, unfortunately. I would build a group called automobiles 0814-2018, and I would just take all automobiles in the system and put them in that group at this moment. So it's not a always up-to-date grouping of assets. It's a grouping of assets that you can build and then do something with it at this point in time. So if I would click my asset group ID, I could select new group here. I could do autos, and then again 081418, building it today. And I could use some of the search tools up here. And I can say just show me all of my class IDs for automobiles, and I built my group for automobiles. I hit OK. You'll see it will not show here. Another frustrating thing with fixed assets. I have to hit clear to refresh the window. Now I can select my group. So I can take this whole list of automobiles, and if I wanted to change their class ID to something else, I could do that. If I wanted to change all of their GL accounts to something else, I could do that. If for tax purposes, I want to change them all to a different bonus depreciation amount, so say this year I want to fully depreciate them 100%, I could select on special depreciation allowance, yes. Basically, whatever I select here is what I'm going to change. Everything else for these assets are going to stay as is. So if I were to do, let's go ahead and do 100% here. And I'm going to apply changes. Oops. I'm going to change it for my federal book. So for tax purposes, for automobiles, 100% depreciation. Apply changes. Hit OK. I can click on the progress here and see that my mass change is complete. And if I were to go back in and do my reporting, I would see that those assets are now fully depreciated for this year for the federal book. So keep in mind, we did change the federal book. It wouldn't have created any GL distributions because we didn't touch the internal book. One last bit here, and we'll kind of tick off. Under reports, under activity, some of the ones you'll care about here, there is a reconciliation report that will kind of help you reconcile your GL to your fixed asset subledger. You can basically get a listing of all your distributions in the fixed asset module, and you could take a look in your GL module with a separate report and kind of glance at the two. There is not a reconcile to GL option for fixed assets, so this is the tool that you will want to rely on when doing the reconciliation process if you need to. So something to keep in mind. The mid-quarter applicability. For tax purposes, there is something to do with the mid-quarter applicability. If you add so many assets in the last quarter, then you can or cannot take bonus depreciation. That report is built into the system, kind of nice. One thing to note is there are no forms built into the system. So I believe it's a Form 896 that you have to file for tax reporting purposes. That number might be off, but there's forms that the IRS requires for fixed assets. They are not built in here. So like the 1099 process for vendors, you can actually generate your 1099s out of the system. You cannot generate those fixed asset forms in the system. So kind of frustrating. One thing I might recommend is if you have these types of observations as you're in the fixed asset system, definitely go out there and add your suggestions to the Microsoft site, and we'll try to make this solution a little better for everyone. Fingers crossed. But I'll digress. So that's the activity reports. If you take a look at the transaction report, you can also get a quick listing of your additions, retirements, and towards the bottom here, your transfers. So all useful reports that someone will most likely be asking you about at some point in time. And so let's take a look at the inquiry. We kind of skimmed over this earlier. It follows the same rules as any other module. If you want to open up just a inquiry window, not with the ability to make changes, you would open up under the inquiry instead of opening up underneath the card. I won't go into the obvious ones like the general in the book, but there's a book compare in here that's pretty cool. You can select your asset, select your different books, and see how it compares. So I see that this asset this is what it looks like for internal book purposes. For AMT, I see that it actually has a higher net book value, so somewhat useful information here. The financial detail inquiry, this is probably your most powerful report in fixed assets, your most powerful inquiry in fixed assets, because it's really an audit log of everything that happens for this single asset. So for the internal book here, I can see that this asset was added back in 2025 period 1. Well, since then, I see all of these depreciation entries. Down here, I see a fixed asset XFRC. So something to do with a fixed asset transfer. With each one of these, I can always click it, drill into the transaction, and see what I'm working with here. So again, this financial detail inquiry window is really your audit for the GL for an asset. Your projection, had we ran the projection process earlier, I could update the projection here and take a look asset by asset. Error log, this is a new one for the fixed assets module, and kind of a good note. Every now and then, fixed assets will spring an error and it'll say error code 36. Literally, that's all it says. If you didn't know better, you would probably go directly to Google, type it in, try to get lucky. But with the error log here under the inquiry section, if an error did occur, it would show error 36, and then it's actually going to give you a little bit of additional detail here. So, nice little note, maybe save you some sanity in the future. The batches, this is kind of another inquiry, so I went back, earlier we posted an entire batch of distributions at once. I could actually pull up in that batch in here and just kind of see it as it was when we posted it. Okay, so the last thing I want to cover here is the process of creating a payables transaction and translating that purchase into an asset in the fixed asset module. So we're going to go into the purchasing, we're going to go under transaction entry. We'll say this is a invoice for a computer. This is a $1,000 purchase for my distributions. Before I had the fixed asset system in place, I would probably just go ahead and debit my fixed asset account. Well, not today. I'm going to debit my fixed asset clearing account because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to debit the clearing account here, and then when I set up the asset, I'm actually going to credit the clearing account and debit my fixed assets. So fixed asset clearing, hit OK. Let's go ahead and post. All right, so now I basically have a pending purchase for a fixed asset in the system. Where you can see that is once I go into fixed assets, cards, and I'm back in the general information window. Earlier, we did not see this top box. Now we do. There are other ways using maybe SmartList or reminders in the system. You can build kind of notes, you can build reminders in the system that you have pending purchases out there that need to be set up in the fixed assets. But for now, the best way to see it is right here in this general asset information window. So I selected my purchase. It brought through the description from the invoice. If I drill into the acquisition cost, you'll see that I actually have that vendor information, that invoice information in here. So Ace Travel, invoice for computer, there's the actual invoice number. All that information flowed through from the purchasing module. First thing I got to do here is select my class. I have computer equipment, and then I could add the rest of the information that I added with the asset that we added earlier. Your location ID, your asset label. Now that I'm adding a computer, this might be a good place to actually put my my barcode or my computer asset label that we actually have tagged on the asset, custodian, all that information once again. But let's go ahead here. This is asset A002. I'm going to go ahead and hit save. Now that I've hit save, I've essentially created the asset in the system, and now I'm really ready to go in and run the GL posting process. So back to routines, back to GL posting. I'm actually just going to select the asset that I was just working with there. Oops. Hit process, and you'll notice here I am debiting fixed assets and I'm crediting my clearing account. So as soon as I post this and I post it again, I am now cleared out of my clearing account and I have a balance sitting in fixed assets. All right, everyone, there you have it. That is Fixed Assets 101. We made it. I mentioned the module itself, it's very bare bones from what Microsoft gives you. There is so much more that you can do with the module than what's just given to you out of the box, whether it be reports, processes. One thing we didn't talk about was construction and process. You can actually use the Fixed Assets module to track construction and process projects. So just keep that in mind. Really, it's very flexible in what it can do. With a little bit of time, a little bit of expertise, you can make it do everything you need it to do. So that's it for today. I would love to hear your feedback on this video. Love to hear what you want to learn about next. So please let me know in the comments below. Subscribe, connect with me on LinkedIn, find me on Facebook. Check out the full blog at alacartegp.com. And that's it for today. Thanks, everyone.